we can say very proudly in the dLive system that you don't have any problems mixing inputs to outputs. Everything is all time aligned, all phase coherent across practically across all the sort of inputs and outputs of the mixing structure. And we've done all that with an amazing total system latency of 0.6 milliseconds. Now that is probably the tightest mixer in the world right now, 96K. So the dLive is doing all that job with all those effects, all those inputs and outputs, and the total latency you're going to be dealing with ever will be 0.6 of a millisecond, which is a fantastic achievement. So very, very, very respected figures, and that's very, very interesting for people who are working with in-ear monitors, because people working with in-ear monitors, I don't know if you know this, if you start using processing and adding in channel EQs and dynamics, you then extending latencies, and it becomes very difficult then to, you've got overall system latency to deal with, so you end up with problems, and people can hear this in their headphones, psychoacoustic problems and also real-time delay problems. So dLive is good, right? Effect sends, which are internal, which will drive the internal effects, they can be mono or stereo. And then in terms of the main bus architecture, the left and right, you can have LR, LRM, and we even got 5.1 surround sound capability built into the mixer. So if you want to use this for production or complicated multi-channel mixing, that can also be possible. And we also created multi-channel PAFL networks as well. So you get to choose out of the 64 channels. We're not telling you how to build your mix. You decide how you want to do that yourself.
And it's quite typical to see on a large tour for a well-known touring artist such as Adele on the world tour there, where the effects on the vocals were
deep processing, that's what we call it. These are the embedded plugins. A lot of people get very excited about plugins and having the flexibility of using plugins and all the rest of it, but they often come with their own set of issues. You know, what do you run them on? How do you connect them up to your mixing system? Do you have a license for these things? Does your firmware support these kind of interactive experience? So our intentions were to provide all the kind of capabilities of really good plugins and very popular processing, but have it in the mixer always available on the channels and in the effects engine. So you didn't have to think about having to have a computer and buy third-party expensive licenses to get something to sound good, because we've already got things sounding great. And so here you can see there some of the emulations there of the vintage sort of limiting compressors, the classics, something like a DBX 160 with a typical interface. These were developed actually for the GLD. So the GLD over there has got these deep processing modules built into it on the channels, and on every output we have a graphic equalizer, but not just one graphic equalizer on every output. You have a choice of 4 per channel, and you can choose whether you want the proportional Q type of graphic EQ, like the Clark Technic, the constant Q, typical sort of BSS type of thing, a Digi EQ, a graphic EQ, which is a very, very accurate, follows precisely the curve that you want to have it, or our own special hybrid EQ. And you can dial these up live and use these in real time and see which one suits the application that you're doing. And you'll find on a GLD, on an iLive, and on a dLive, 4 graphic EQs on every output. So no licenses to worry about. Everything's always there on board. It's been taken years to get them perfected, and this deep processing is embedded inside. And of course, you don't need any worry about installing any of this or having licenses or having any phase issues by inserting things into the signal pathway, then have to correct it for phase or latencies later on. And now we can go even deeper with this, as Rob was saying, with this FPGA processing power available. We can now take the deep plugins and go even crazier when it comes to like the depths that this stuff can do, with really, really sort of deeper emulations, able to grab parts of the signal processing and do more with it and bring it to life in a way we couldn't dream of before. So it's very, very exciting. This new opto compressor with an emulation of the sort of LED they took over from the original opto compressor was a bit slow, using a light bulb to give you the ballistics for the way the compressor reacted. Then they went to an LED, and this works on that, and then looks at afterburn of the LEDs. All sorts of layers and layers and layers of geekiness going on, which is fantastic because you get to use these controls and hear the results in a really, really brilliant unit. And when there's one of these on every input channel, 128 compressors on board, and you get to choose which type of compressor you want to use. And there's more coming. As the sentence says down there, we're looking at preamp modeling, where we can choose different type of front ends, different types of EQ, dynamic EQs on input channels. You know, it's really great. We have the processing power to be able to offer these in future firmware updates. The Rack Extra effects, these are some of the latest effects. We've got a Leslie simulator, you know, the rotating speaker from the Hammond organ, classical unit there with a valve overdrive tube drive in it, a de-esser, very responsive, accurate de-esser, a copy of something called an SPL transient designer, which we call the transient controller, and a bucket brigade delay. These are typical of the type of effects. You can see they look great, and of course this is the sort of thing where people say, I want plugins because I want to look like the original. Well, we've got things looking like originals or better or even created from scratch, but they look amazing, and they're available in the effects engines. You know, you just need to go to the effects screen and choose from the library, and these things are there. And you can change this scene by scene, song by song, band by band, different events. So you have, 500 scene memories on there, 16 effects engines. The world's your oyster when it comes to setting things up in signal paths and having lots of different types of processing available for different jobs. Every effects return also has a 4-band parametric EQ. So you get 120 input channels plus 16 stereo effects returns, all with 4-band PEQ. There's no compromise about bringing effects back into the mix and losing your line inputs or losing stereo channels to do that. You can also insert any of these effects on input channels and output channels, mono and stereo. So you can bring a stereo Leslie effect onto a stereo keyboard channel itself instead of using an effects send and return. It was also incredibly important, besides keeping the great sound quality and taking it further, to look at where the mix has been used, what was good about the iLive, how we could improve that. And we found that people loved the sound quality, but we often were told, well, we need redundancy, the desk needs to do this, and we need redundant cables and power supplies. And there's always a reason why it couldn't be used on the top tours. And okay, right, well, we'll listen to all this stuff, and now we're going to respond. So we'd like to think that this, for the money we're charging for this mixer, which is really good value, we've got a pro touring grade mixer. This is a really strong, rugged mixer built out of steel. It's not terribly heavy, but it's not light. You can tell you're buying something which is pretty chunky. We've designed a power supply which is swappable across the whole range. So instead of relying on internal power supplies, we have a power supply which can be removed by 4 screws, and you can pull it out, and you can have 1 or 2 in everything. So the mixer has 2 slots, the rack has 2 slots, the expander module, which we'll see in a minute, has 2 slots. And you can take this power supply and use it in any of them. So if something breaks or blows up or gets broken, then it's not the end of the world, because you can take it out of somewhere else and move it around and do your own diagnostics and do your own fixes on the road. So it's very important to have this power supply design. We also looked at the audio connections between the rack and the surface and the expanders. And we've made sure that those also have redundant capability. So they use Cat5 cables typically, and you can use 1 cable. So if it's sitting in a room like this and we're just doing a demo in the theater or whatever, something where it's not moving around too much, you may be happy with one cable. If you're in a more tricky environment where there's lots of things being moved, people moving cases around, people walking on cables that can get damaged, then you may want to use 2 cables, and that's your choice. You can use 1 or 2 when you interconnect the system to give you redundancy. 1 cable gets broken, it swaps over to the other cable, no loss of audio. We also wanted to concentrate very much on things like visibility and the way the mixer could be seen, and the way the controls and everything would be seen under different lighting conditions. So we've basically made a big change about the way it looks. You notice that the mixer is lit up from a screen, along the top here. It's got built-in lighting. That means, let's move this down here. You don't need to have lights coming over the top. And all this stuff is adjustable. So if we go to the screen settings here, we can actually choose the lighting mode. So we can go from a bright light, where we need to see really what we're doing here, and we can actually adjust the brightness of that. So we can go right down to working in the theater, dark, up to very, very bright. We can go anywhere between white and deep blue, very moody. So that's an amazing looking mixer, and it gives you a really nice sort of environment to be working in. And it's all completely adjustable. The touch screens can adjust in brightness. The LEDs themselves that are on the channels and the metering and everything can be all adjusted. So quite a a good effort gone into the kind of illumination side of the mixer. And this has enabled us to make something which looks amazing. Already we're turning heads. People are saying, wow, you know, that is completely different from what you've done in the past. And I think it's just sort of, you know, sort of first impressions. It really helps. But we found that, you know, especially things like the metering is incredibly bright. It can be used in direct sunshine, and you can see what you're doing. We also now have custom rotary controls with an LED built in. So now for the first time, our rotary controls can change color depending on what job they're doing. For example, the channel rotaries, if they're red, then that means they're gain controls. If they're yellow, the pan controls. Then you have custom functions as well. So it's very easy for the mixer to respond to what you're doing and change for you. And we really spent a long time thinking about the way the materials we used in the desk. For example, this armrest at the front here, I don't know if you've noticed that's got a slight curve in the front. The boss decided that when you're standing at the mixer, it's quite nice to sort of get close to the mixer, so it's actually got a curve for the more well-built people like myself. We've got nice sort of rubbery arm cheeks on here, really nice smooth tops and anodized kind of feel to the metal. You know, it's an amazing, amazing experience we've come up with. The system is a scalable system, which means that you can grow to suit the job you're doing. As soon as we invest in a dLive, you have the capabilities of all those channels and all that processing. But to keep the price cost effective, you can buy a smaller mix rack, and that's not the processing, that's just how many inputs and outputs you plug in that one place. And then what you can do is you can then add expander modules off the surface, and you can add 2 expander modules off the mix rack to give you different I/O where you want it. So you have a basic mixing brain, mixing engine with expansion possibilities, which can be located right next door to the mixer, or they could be located 100 meters away in an outside truck or in a different room. So for installations and different flexible kind of situations, that can be scaled up to how you want to work. We now have 3 ports on the mixer rack itself and 2 on the surface, which we'll see in detail in a future slide. But that, if you remember on the iLive and GLD, if you've been lucky enough to work with one of those, we have an option card which was a 64-way digital card, such as Waves or MADI or Dante. But you could only have 1. Now we can say you have 5. No other mixing system at this price comes anywhere close to giving you that kind of flexibility, that number of option ports and those number of channels. So you can basically configure this system to be a very, very powerful patching system, mixing system, scalable, remote I/O in different places. The link to the surface, between the surface and the mix rack, is a Cat5 cable, and we're calling that one GigaRace. That's included as standard. So all the customer needs, all you need is a Cat5 cable, switch it on, you've got a system. And if you want to use 2 cables, 100 meters long, that's up to you. On those cables, we're running 300 channels at 96K backwards and forwards down those cables. So lots and lots of channels for patching inputs and outputs, local I/O at the surface. The expanders, the DX expanders we're calling those, they allow you to have additional inputs and outputs at the surface or on stage.